I remember the exact moment my world cracked open, like a glass dropped on tile. Too sudden, too loud, and far too impossible to put back together. It was a Sunday. I had just gotten back from the grocery store, arms sore from carrying and all. The bags alone because Liam said his back was hurting again, and I didn't even think twice about it. I never did. Because when you love someone for almost a decade, you don't keep score. You don't question every ache and excuse. You just carry on, thinking you're building something real, something permanent. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen and saw my sister, Rachel, sitting at the counter with that look on her face, the one that said she wanted to speak but didn't know how to start, I swear my stomach turned to stone before she even opened her mouth. She was never a good liar, and when her eyes filled with tears, my mind leaped to 100 possibilities. None of them good, but not a single one prepared me for what she said. Not for the words that came out in a rush, like she had to get them out before she lost the nerve. I'm pregnant, and it's Liam's, and in that moment, everything inside me collapsed. My throat went dry, my knees buckled, and I just stared at her like she'd grown another head, like maybe I'd misheard, maybe she'd said something else and I was losing my mind. But then Liam walked in, didn't even look surprised, just hung his head like a child caught stealing. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I couldn't breathe, couldn't cry, couldn't scream. I just stood there with my keys still in my hand, and the grocery bags at my feet, and the smell of fresh cilantro suddenly making me nauseous. And I whispered, "Tell me this is some sick joke." But no one answered. No one said anything, and when my mother called later that night after Rachel had left, asking if I was okay, I thought maybe finally someone would see how shattered I was, but instead she said, "Sweetheart, she's family, and she made a mistake, but she's scared and needs support right now." And I nearly dropped the phone. I asked her if she heard what Rachel did, that she was carrying my husband's child, that she'd betrayed me in the worst way a sister could, and my mother had the audacity to tell me, "You always had the perfect life." Maybe she just wanted a piece of that. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about betrayal. This was about my family's inability to hold Rachel accountable for anything. Like every mess she made deserved to be cleaned up by someone else. And I was always the someone else, always the fixer, the one expected to forgive, to understand, to be the bigger person. But not this time. No, I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror without feeling like a fool. Like the last 10 years were just some elaborate prank that everyone else was in on but me. And Liam had the nerve to come back 2 days later and ask if we could talk. Sitting on the couch like he hadn't lit my entire life on fire, saying he didn't mean for it to happen, that it started one night when we had a fight and I went to stay with my friend Claire, and Rachel came by to check on him, and one thing led to another, and I couldn't even listen. I couldn't take the way he tried to paint himself as the victim of loneliness, or the way he kept saying it was a moment of weakness. Because what about the weeks after that, the months, the times he came home and kissed me and told me he loved me while knowing he'd already crossed that line? And the worst part was, I kept wondering what I had done wrong. Like somehow I'd caused this. Maybe I'd been too focused on work, too distracted to notice the cracks forming, but that's what women are taught, right? To take the blame, to find fault in themselves even when they're the ones bleeding. And I hated that even in my heartbreak. I was still trying to make sense of their choices instead of letting myself feel angry. And then Rachel texted me, saying she hoped we could talk soon, because she didn't want her baby growing up in a broken family, and I swear I almost threw my phone across the room. How dare she use the baby as leverage, as if that child wasn't conceived in betrayal. As if her pregnancy meant I had to forgive her. But the worst betrayal wasn't even what they did. It was what my family said after. How my father told me, "These things happen, and it's better to move on than hold a grudge." And how my brother said, "At least it was someone you know," like that made it better. Like somehow Liam cheating with my sister was a lesser evil than if it had been a stranger. And I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, because everyone around me was minimizing what happened, treating it like a minor family dispute instead of the earthquake it truly was. And I stopped answering calls, stopped going to work. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rachel's face, heard her voice, remembered how we used to be kids who shared secrets and whispered under the covers during storms, and now she'd become the monster in my story, and I couldn't reconcile that. Couldn't understand how someone who once held my hand during nightmares could become the very thing that haunted me. And as the days passed, I felt myself withdrawing, curling inward, like if I just got small enough, quiet enough, maybe I could disappear. Because what was left for me now? My marriage was a lie, my sister was a lie, my family chose her over me, and I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Because the people I loved most had lit the match and walked away, expecting me to smile through the flames. I didn't even know where to start picking up the pieces because no one around me seemed to think anything was broken. It was like I was screaming underwater while everyone else was dancing on the shore, sipping wine and calling it a misunderstanding. And the more I tried to explain how deep the hurt went, the more I realized no one wanted to hear it. They didn't want the burden of my pain. They just wanted the drama to be over, to pretend everything was fine so they could move on. And every time I heard one of them say, "It's not like they planned to fall in love," I wanted to laugh. because what does that even mean? Who accidentally destroys someone's life like that and still gets treated like the one who needs protecting? And I kept wondering if this would be easier if it had been anyone else. If Liam had cheated with a coworker or a stranger at a bar, would I still feel like the world had turned against me? Or would I have at least gotten the dignity of sympathy? But because it was Rachel, my family couldn't bear to admit she did something unforgivable, so they made it my job to be understanding, to keep the family together, to be the good daughter and the bigger sister. And I hated that word bigger, because it always meant swallowing my pain, always meant making space for everyone else's comfort while mine got crushed under the weight of what was expected. And I started getting messages from extended family too, cousins I hadn't talked to in years, all saying things like, "Don't let this tear the family apart," like it was my reaction that was the problem, and not the betrayal itself. And I didn't respond to any of them, because what could I say that wouldn't sound like begging for permission to be broken? And one night I just got in my car and drove. No destination, no plan, just the road and the radio and the sound of my breath trying to steady itself. I ended up at a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that smells like damp carpet and old cigarettes. But I didn't care. I just needed to not be in that house, not see our wedding photo on the wall or the blanket Rachel gave us as a housewarming gift. How poetic, how utterly cruel. And I sat on that motel bed and stared at the ceiling until morning, asking myself how long I'd been pretending. How long had I looked the other way when Liam pulled away? How many times had I ignored Rachel's long glances at him, chalking it up to nothing because the thought was too awful to entertain? But the worst part was the memories. They wouldn't stop replaying, like little knives slicing me open one by one. The Christmas we spent at my parents' house. How Rachel had insisted on taking our couple photo because I'm better at finding your angles. Or the time Liam had a work dinner and I couldn't go, and Rachel offered to drop something off for him, and I had thanked her. I thanked her. God, how naive could I have been? And it wasn't just what they did. It was that they both looked me in the eye and lived in my life like nothing was wrong. Like they weren't already sharing a secret that would gut me. And I kept trying to figure out what kind of person you have to be to do that. To destroy your own sister, your own wife, and still sleep at night. And the answer I kept coming back to was this. People only care about betrayal when it happens to them. And my family only cared about keeping the peace, not protecting the wounded. And when I finally called Claire, my best friend since college, and told her everything, she didn't say you'll get through this or forgive and forget. She said, "That's monstrous, and I'm so sorry." And I cried harder than I had in days, because someone finally said it. Finally didn't try to soften the blow or make excuses. She offered to let me stay with her, said I didn't have to be alone. And I packed what little I had into a bag and left that motel without looking back. And when Liam texted asking where I was, I didn't respond, because what was there to say? And a few days later, my mother showed up at Claire's apartment, unannounced, holding a Tupperware container like she thought soup could fix this. She looked around like she was disappointed in the decor, and then said, "You've made your point, sweetheart. Now come home and let's deal with this like adults." And I almost laughed, because wasn't I the one who was abandoned? The one who'd been lied to and cheated on and betrayed, but I had to come home to make things easier for them. And I told her no, not angrily, not dramatically, just no. And her face changed, twisted in that way mothers do when they realize their child is no longer willing to play the role they were cast in. And she said, "You've always been so unforgiving." And I realized she wasn't here for me. She was here to patch the family image, to restore the illusion that we were still whole. And when I asked her if she would have forgiven Dad if he'd gotten Aunt Jo pregnant, she gasped and said, "That's not the same thing." And I said, "Yes, it is." And she left without another word. And I curled up on Claire's couch and stared out the window and thought, maybe this is what healing looks like, not pretty or triumphant, but messy and quiet and lonely. And maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't need to forgive them to find peace. Maybe I just need to stop needing them. And that thought scared me. It shook me, because I'd built my whole identity around being the one who stayed, the one who held it all together, and now I was letting it fall apart. Watching the pieces scatter, wondering who I was if I wasn't the dependable daughter, or the loyal wife, or the endlessly forgiving sister. Maybe I was just me, hurt and furious, and raw, but still standing, still breathing, still here. The days started to blur together in Claire's apartment. The quiet safety of her guest room becoming the only place where my thoughts didn't feel like they were eating me alive. And I remember waking up every morning with a few seconds of peace. Just those first few breaths before memory rushed in like a tidal wave, reminding me all over again that my life had shattered in slow motion, and somehow I was expected to be okay with that. And every text from my mom, every missed call from Liam, every email from Rachel was like a new wound, reopening the old ones before they had even begun to scar. And Claire, God bless her, she tried. She made me tea I never drank and offered to take me out when I didn't even want to shower, and she never pressured me to talk. But one night, when we were watching something on Netflix I wasn't even following, she paused it and said softly, "You don't have to let them make you feel like the villain." And I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until I let it go, because that's exactly what it felt like. like somehow I was being framed as the one who was destroying the family by not forgiving them, like I was the unreasonable one for not smiling through my own personal apocalypse. And the worst part was that even part of me believed it, because that's how deeply it had been ingrained in me, that to love meant to endure, to suffer silently for the sake of others. And I started to question everything, not just them, but me, who I was before all of this, who I had let myself become by trying to be everything to everyone, always accommodating, always agreeable. And now here I was, broken but stubborn, devastated but unyielding, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing for it, and yet the grief didn't stop. It changed shape, morphed into something quieter but heavier, something that sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't cough up. And it wasn't just about losing Liam, or even Rachel. It was about losing the story I had told myself all my life that my family would protect me, that love meant loyalty, that doing the right thing would earn me peace. But now I knew better. Now I knew that sometimes the people who are supposed to catch you are the ones who push you, and that love, real love, doesn't ask you to shrink or sacrifice yourself until there's nothing left. And I remember one afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop with Claire, and she was telling me about a job opportunity she thought I should apply for. And I just stared at her and said, "How do you start over when you don't even know who you are anymore?" And she looked at me like she was seeing me, really seeing me, and she said, "Maybe that's the gift in all this, you finally get to choose." And I hadn't cried in days. But those words unlocked something, because for the first time, I saw a path, not an easy one, not a smooth one, but one where I got to rebuild on my terms. And a week later, I went to our house. No, not our house anymore, just a building filled with ghost sand. I packed my things while Liam watched from the living room, silent, like he knew he had no right to ask for anything. And still he tried. He said he missed me, that he didn't know how to fix this, but he'd do anything. And I said, "You already did everything, Liam. That's the problem." And I walked out with boxers in my arms and no ring on my finger, and the air felt a little lighter, not because it didn't hurt, but because I wasn't carrying the weight of pretending anymore. And Rachel called the next day, left a voicemail, saying she was going to keep the baby and hoped one day I could be part of its life. And I deleted it without listening to the end. Not out of cruelty, but because I was finally starting to understand that I didn't owe her anything. Not my time, not my forgiveness, not my place at baby showers or hospital rooms. And my mother stopped by Claire's again, this time with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips. But even then, even in her sorrow, she asked if I could just meet Rachel halfway, and I said no again, louder this time, firmer. And she said, "You'll regret pushing us away." And I looked her in the eye and said, "No, I regret not doing it sooner." And I meant it. Because for the first time, my boundaries weren't just lines in the sand. They were walls, strong and unshakable, and I was done letting guilt be the currency that bought my silence. And maybe my family would never understand that. Maybe they would always see me as the problem, the one who refused to forgive, the one who broke the illusion. But I'd rather be hated for telling the truth than loved for swallowing it. And even in the loneliness, even in the grief, I knew I was closer to peace than I had ever been. The silence that followed was different now. Not the crushing kind that made my lungs seize up, but the clean, unfamiliar kind that allowed me to think, to breathe without waiting for the next punch to the gut. And I spent my days slowly pieces of myself, pieces I hadn't even realized I'd handed over in little exchanges, agreeing to things I didn't want, smiling when I wanted to scream, being the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who swallowed her own needs so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. And it was like waking up after a long fever, my body still aching, my heart still bruised, but finally, clear-headed enough to see just how long I'd been living under the weight of other people's expectations. And I started journaling again, something I hadn't done in years. Pages filled with rage, sorrow, confusion, pages where I didn't censor myself, where I didn't soften the truth for anyone's comfort. And in those raw, shaky words, I began to understand just how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being loved by people who didn't really see me. Not fully, not without the version of me they preferred. And one day I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim anymore. I saw a woman who had survived something catastrophic and still managed to get out of bed, to go to work, to breathe through the nights, even when the pain clung to her ribs like it was stitched there. And I started therapy not because I was broken, but because I was finally ready to stop carrying everyone else's weight in addition to my own. And the therapist asked me, during one of our first sessions, what I needed from the people who hurt me, and I said, nothing. And I meant it not out of bitterness, but because I was done waiting for apologies that would never come, for understanding that would never be offered, for family who only stood by me when I was convenient, agreeable, or silent. And letting go of that fantasy was like taking a deep breath after drowning for years. And even though it still hurt, I realized I could live with that pain if it meant living on my own terms. And I began applying to jobs in different cities, ones far away from the tangled mess of familiar streets and family events and grocery store run-ins with people who looked at me like I was the one who burned the bridge. And Claire helped me pack when the offer came through, a modest position, at a nonprofit in another state, not glamorous but honest, and most importantly, mine. earned by me, separate from anyone else's choices or destruction. And on the day I left, my mom called again. This time leaving a voicemail that started with, "I don't understand why you're doing this," and ended with, "You'll always be welcome if you decide to come back." And I listened to it 3 times before deleting it, not because I hated her, but because I didn't want to carry her confusion with me. Didn't want to spend another mile on the road wondering how she could still be asking the wrong questions. And I drove through state lines with the windows down, the wind tangling my hair and something in my chest loosening, uncoiling. Something like freedom, something like relief. And when I got to the tiny apartment the nonprofit had arranged for me, I sat on the bare floor with my boxers around me and cried, not out of despair, but out of exhaustion, out of gratitude, out of the sheer weight of beginning again. And in the weeks that followed, I began to settle into a new rhythm, one where I didn't check my phone compulsively, one where I didn't feel like I was bracing for another betrayal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the anger began to fade, because I forgave, but because it no longer held me hostage. And I learned that healing isn't linear, that some mornings I'd wake up feeling powerful and whole, and by afternoon I'd be curled up on the couch wondering how love could have betrayed me so cruelly. But even on those days, I didn't pick up the phone. Didn't reach out to the people who once made me question my worth, because I knew now that peace wasn't about being surrounded by others. It was about being able to sit with yourself and not feel like you're unraveling. And I no longer felt the need to justify my choices, not to my mother, not to Rachel, not to Liam, not even to the parts of myself that still ached for understanding. And one evening, sitting on my little balcony with a glass of wine, I finally let myself picture the baby Rachel's baby, Liam's baby, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was going to break in half. I didn't wish it away, didn't curse its existence. I just sat with the truth of it, the complexity of it, and realized that the child wasn't my enemy, wasn't responsible for the wreckage left behind. And I whispered into the wind, "I hope you never know what they did, because that child deserved a clean slate, even if the people raising it didn't." And maybe that was the closest I'd ever get to forgiveness. Not for them, but for myself, for the part of me that needed closure, for the part that finally understood that sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of apologies or punishment. It comes in reclaiming your life, one painful step at a time. It's strange how a story can start with betrayal and end in clarity. Not the kind of clarity that makes things easier, but the kind that strips away illusions until all you have left is the truth, cold and bare, and still to build on. And as the seasons changed in my new city, so did I, in ways that felt both subtle and seismic. Like one day, I realized I hadn't thought about Liam in weeks, and the guilt that used to grip my throat whenever I smiled without shame had finally started to ease its grip. And the silence that once terrified me had become something I cherished, a gentle background to the life I was slowly, stubbornly creating from scratch. And I learned to enjoy little things again, morning light on hardwood floors, the smell of coffee in the kitchen I decorated myself, the feeling of choosing who I let into my world instead of being tethered to people simply because we shared blood. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't measuring my worth by how much I could endure. I wasn't stretching myself thin to keep others comfortable. I was just living, and it wasn't always pretty. There were days I still cried in the shower, still stared too long at old photos before shutting the box. They were hidden in, but those moments no longer defined me. They were just part of the process, like faded bruises that no longer throb but still remind you where the hurt had been. And when Claire visited one weekend, she hugged me like she was proud of who I'd become. And maybe that's what hit me the hardest, that I had become someone else. Someone who chose herself, not in defiance or bitterness, but in quiet, steady respect. And one night, as we sat on my balcony, she asked if I ever thought about going back, not to them, but to make peace. And I said I didn't know. Because forgiveness isn't always a door you walk through. Sometimes it's a decision to stop dragging their sins behind you like chains. And I hadn't forgiven Rachel, and I didn't think I ever would, not because I wished her harm, but because I didn't believe she earned access to the version of me I had fought so hard to reclaim. And Liam, well, he became less and less real to me with each passing month, like a character from a book I once read in the dark, a story I survived but never one to reread. And I heard from a mutual friend that the baby was born, a girl, and for a fleeting second, I wondered if she looked like me, if she had my eyes or my laugh or my stubborn chin. And then I stopped myself, not out of pain, but because I knew that was no longer my story to carry, and I didn't want it. I had enough of my own to tell. And sometime after that, I started writing again, not just journal entries or fragments of grief, but stories, fictional ones, stories about women who burn and rise, who lose everything, and still find their way back to themselves. And maybe that's how I finally made peace, not by pretending it didn't happen, but by telling it in a way that gave me back my voice. Because for so long, I had been spoken over, silenced, reduced to the girl who got cheated on, the sister who wouldn't forgive, the daughter who walked away, and now I was so much more. I was a woman who chose her dignity over family dinners, her truth over their comfort. And even though there would always be parts of me that wished it had been different, that wished the people I loved hadn't turned out to be strangers, I knew that regret was just another weight I didn't have to carry, and I let it go, like smoke rising into a sky that didn't ask for explanations. And maybe, just maybe, that's what healing looks like, not getting over it, not forgetting, but walking forward anyway, lighter, freer, finally unburdened.